Welcome back, guys. You guys can say hi to Bear. Anyway, whew, book review time. So one of the first books I read of the year was, well, I was finishing it really, was Killers of the Flower Moon by David Gran. Now, I feel like I did a video on the movie back when I saw it. Fantastic, very well done, must see. This is a must read. Must read. Now, I will say that from book to movie, it was very, very well done. Were there things missing out? Yes, but mainly some history lessons, because the way that David Gran wrote the book was that he paused for a moment, put in like a little history lesson, and then continue the story. And it was quite interestingly done. Like, it's not the first time I read a book like that, but I appreciated it even more knowing excuse me, having seen the movie and just knowing even more, right? Like, more tidbits of information, and it makes me want to read more of his books, but also it makes me hope that those that were involved in the making of Killers of the Flower Moon behind the scenes, like the producers, the production, who was it? Martin Scorsese, right? He was the main guy to make this work. I hope that he or someone like him, right, continues on, because the representation in that movie, using the book, I don't want to say using, but hiring, right? Using kind of insinuates that, oh, there were bad things about it, but having that proper representation, right, with the actors, having actual sorry guys, I'm the actual Osage Nation on set using their very real language, right? Having actual Osage members in the movie, and the clothing and the music, having it with proper representation and not just like an overcast, kind of like I'm gonna say it, kind of like the Disney princessy, like Pocahontas, right? Like, there were some great lines in Pocahontas, but it was very whitewashed. And yes, Pocahontas is a real person. Her name is Matoka. But you guys get the sense that it was just whitewashed, right? Like, there was no true history behind the movie, right? Whereas with Killers of the Flower Moon, it was. Now, I've kind of talked about the movie a little bit more, but 5-star rating for this book. I want to read more Indigenous authors. I've read quite a few, but my goal for this year is to read a more diverse array of authors, specifically more Indigenous. I'm looking for more Pacific Islanders, Asian. I have a whole list of Asian authors, queer authors, specifically also neurodivergent or chronically ill, disabled authors as well. I don't care what genre. I'm just looking for more books. More books the better, right? So, must read. Definitely must read. I think that this is a lesson that we should be learning in American history. I did not learn this in American history. Not in college, not in high school. And that's also something that my mother had talked about because I went to see the movie with her. And she was so upset by the movie, right, that she did not learn this history. And she was a history major, an American history major. And one thing that bothered me in my schooling, right, I went to 3 amazing schools in New York City. But even then, right, I felt there was such a lack of Indigenous history. Yeah, we covered a few, but it was so basic. And as someone who has Indigenous ancestry, right, my father, my biological father is Indigenous. His whole side is San Carlos Apache. Some live on the reservation and are, or were, it's complicated, registered. Some are not. I mean, there's a whole big thing. But one thing that bothered me growing up, not just because of my adoption, but was that I had to teach myself about Indigenous people more. You know, when we learned about Indigenous people, we learned, oh yeah, like there's Plains people, there's, you know, there's those that use teepees, there's those that use longhouses, there's, you know, the Inuits and stuff, but like we didn't really deep dive into, like, it was just very overcast, right? Even with like the Aztecs and the Incas, we didn't really dive into it. It was very whitewashed. And to know now that there are I think there's 574 American Indigenous tribes recognized, federally recognized, and I say that because there are also non-recognized tribes still. But we only see a little bit, right? Like growing up, you know, in school only, right? I'm only talking about in school. Like, yeah, we learned a little bit about the Cherokees, the Mohawk Nation. We learned a little bit about Apaches, but like, you know, I will say that going to camp, right? I'm in upstate New York. I learned more about Indigenous people through my 4-H camp, which they no longer do in terms of the tribes, right? They used to have the 6 tribes of New York, right? It's now called, it was the Iroquois Confederacy, or also known as I know they changed the name, hold on. I forgot what, Haudenosaunee. I know that they changed the name to Haudenosaunee recently, for full time, right? And so my camp, right, we were split up into 6 platoons, the 6 tribes of New York State. And that's actually how I learned about the tribes in New York. Was, you know, yeah, we didn't do a huge deep dive, but I did learn their names, right? So we have the Iroquois, aka the Haudenosaunee, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. I learned more about Indigenous history, right? Like they would tell little tales, or like we learned about this because of camp, 4-H camp. Now they don't do that, right? They call them platoons, A, B, C, D, right? A, B, C. D, E, F, and G. Wait. F? Yeah. And then, like, based off the theme, like, if it's a pirate theme, you come up with, like, a pirate name or something. They switched that, like, back when I was still there. It was, like, one of my last years as a camper, and then I was a counselor. But it made me sad because it was like you're erasing Indigenous history, right? I understand that they were trying to do, like, proper representation, but I almost feel like had they kept the names and then, like, told a myth, right? Or told a little bit of the history or something, like, that would have been so much better. Sorry, we're getting off topic, but I just hope that you guys get the point that, like, even with great education, we don't really learn about the tribes. Now, that being said, I deep dive onto tribes, okay? Like, I've been learning more about Indigenous history, Indigenous mythology, or folklore, the stories, the creation stories. Sorry, guys, and this book was so fantastically done with switching between characters, but also having, like, that almost narrator. It, like, had that narrator view, but also, like I said, it, like, paused for tidbits of history. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It's definitely something that I would highly recommend to other people. A book that I would reread, in the future. There's a few books that I want to reread eventually. I have, like, thousands of books on my list, but this is on my reread category, like, must. And it is a book that I plan on using for my son when he's in high school. Now, something that I do with my son is we do talk about Indigenous history, right? We do talk about not only our ancestry as San Carlos Apache, right? One book that I have that I loved having growing up, but I didn't really read it until he was little. I know it sounds crazy. Was I have a book of it's called American Indian mythology and lore. I read him those stories since he was young. And my son's not, like, the biggest reader, doesn't truly like listening to books, but he loves those stories. He loves asking those questions. And he's proud of our history as, Apaches. And something that I learned, throughout the time, not about the Osage, although very important, right, was how, we've been surviving, right? How we are fighters. We are intelligent. We make do with what we have, even though we are given some of the worst dealt hands possible, right? Those on the reservations are in some of the worst conditions ever. And when I say worst conditions, I mean the way that the government has pushed Indigenous people onto plots of land that you cannot farm is horrific. Some of these tribes don't have access to water. The food scarcity with, terms of grocery stores, the education, there are specific schools on the reservation, but also, like, the books that they get, like, it's all whitewashed. And I think, excuse me, I think it's important to note this continues to happen, right? This started back with Andrew Jackson, I think even before him, but he did the Trail of Tears and has continued. This book really represents specifically the Osage Nation and the FBI murders, and it was also during the time of what was it? The Tulsa Race Massacre, right? Another thing that we don't often hear a lot about, right? Like a lot of our history, we just kind of go over. And I think that's why, you know, the last few years I've been more focused on reading own voices, right? Reading books by authors with their proper representation, because it's so important to listen to. Anyway, must read. I have quite a few other Indigenous books that I plan on reading, but I'm going to check out David Grant's other books, and that'll probably be later in the year because I have a lot of books on my list right now. But I will say, great book, great to listen to, but also must watch for the movie.